The man standing behind her in line ran a syndicate that stretched across 2 continents, and he had never once let a decision take longer than 10 seconds. Not with money, not with enemies, not with anything that mattered. That night, in a Koreatown grocery store with rain sliding down the windows, he spent 5 seconds holding out a black card to cover a $22 deficit for a stranger he had never met. He didn't know what that 5 seconds would cost him. She didn't either. 5 days later, his armored sedan would be electronically hijacked at 80 miles an hour, his chest crushed, his heart flatlining on a stainless steel gurney, while the city's top surgical chiefs looked at his scans and quietly agreed there was nothing left to save. The elite doctors would step back. His own lieutenants would start making calls they never wanted to make. And in the same hospital where she had spent years being talked over, passed over, and quietly erased from her own surgical victories, a trauma surgeon nobody in that building respected enough to promote would turn out to be the only person on earth who knew how to bring him back. If you're the kind of person who believes small moments of decency don't just disappear into thin air, stay with me, and while you're here, drop where you're watching from in the comments, hit that follow, because this story earns it by the end. My name is Dr. Lily Spears. For years I stood in operating rooms saving lives while men with half my skill took credit for my hands. I told myself it didn't matter, that the work would speak for itself eventually. It doesn't always. But on a rainy Tuesday night, exhausted and humiliated by a declined card in front of a line of strangers, a quiet man I had never seen before paid my grocery bill without asking my name, without waiting for a thank you, without a single camera in sight. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because 5 days later, that same man would be wheeled into my hospital with every doctor in the building convinced he was already gone, and I would have to decide whether to follow orders or follow what I actually knew how to do. Stay until the end, because what happened in that operating room didn't just save his life. It changed what I was allowed to become. He didn't ask for my name at that register. He was about to find out it was the only name standing between him and a body bag, but that night, standing under the fluorescent lights of a Koreatown grocery store with rain streaking the windows, I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I had been awake for 26 hours, that my scrubs still smelled like antiseptic and someone else's blood, and that the cashier was looking at me with the particular kind of pity reserved for a grown woman whose card had just been declined in front of 6 people. I'd worked a trauma shift that should have ended at 7 in the morning. It didn't end until 3 in the afternoon because a 19-year-old came in with a gunshot wound to the abdomen, and I was the only surgeon in that building who could stop the bleeding fast enough to keep him breathing. I saved him. I always save them. And 2 days before that, I'd watched Dr. Reyes, a man who'd been out of residency 4 years less than me and who couldn't close a wound half as clean as mine, get handed the trauma department director position I'd been quietly, patiently, foolishly waiting 3 years for. Nobody in that boardroom mentioned my name. Nobody mentioned the 11-hour surgery I'd pulled off the month before that made the hospital's annual report. In that building, credit only traveled in one direction, and it was never toward me. So there I was, running on fumes, standing in a checkout line with a box of the only cereal Nia would eat, a bag of apples, and the antibiotic her pediatrician had prescribed for the ear infection that had kept her up crying the night before. $91.40. My card came back declined. Insurance had been sitting on a reimbursement for 6 weeks. My mortgage had cleared that morning, and somewhere in the math of being a single mother and the only black woman in my department, I had come up $22 short of dignity. The cashier ran it again, declined again. Behind me, a woman sighed loud enough for the whole line to hear it, and a man muttered something about people needing to check their balance before they get in line. I felt my face go hot. I have stood in operating rooms holding a human heart in my hands without my pulse rising above 60. But standing in that line, I felt exposed in a way that surgery never touches, the specific shame of being seen as someone who can't provide, in front of strangers who will never know what your hands are capable of. I started pulling items out of the bag, the apples first. Then I reached for the antibiotics, and my hand actually shook, because that was the one thing I couldn't put back. That was when a card slid past my shoulder, black, heavier than mine, the kind that doesn't ask permission from a bank before it works. "Put it all on this," a voice said, calm and unbothered, like he was ordering coffee. I turned. A Korean man, maybe mid-30s, sharply dressed in a way that didn't belong in a Koreatown grocery store at 9 at night, dark wool coat, no umbrella, hair damp from the rain he'd clearly walked through without hurrying. He wasn't looking at me like I was a problem to solve. He was looking at me the way you look at someone you've decided, without needing a reason, is worth 5 seconds of your time. "You don't have to do that," I said, "because that's what you say, even when your bank account is telling you a different truth." "I know," he said. He didn't smile the way people smile when they want something back. It was smaller than that, quieter, like he'd already decided the conversation was over before it started. The cashier ran his card. Approved, instantly, the way money moves when it's never had to argue with anyone. He didn't ask my name. He didn't wait for me to thank him properly, didn't linger for a photo, didn't hand me a business card the way men in this city do when they want you to remember who was generous. He picked up my bag before I could stop him, set it gently on the counter beside the register, gave me one short nod, and walked back out into the rain like it had never stopped falling on him in the first place. I stood there holding a receipt for $91 I hadn't paid, staring at the door as it swung shut behind a stranger I would never see again. Or so I thought. Because there was one thing about him that stayed with me the whole drive home, something I couldn't shake even after I'd tucked Nia in and given her the medicine and sat alone at my kitchen table with the receipt still folded in my coat pocket, his hands. Steady, unhurried, precise in the way he'd handled that card, in the way he'd set down my groceries without a single wasted motion. I've spent my career reading hands. Surgeons learn to. And something about the stillness in his told me he wasn't a man who was often gentle, but that tonight, for reasons I couldn't name, he had chosen to be. I didn't know his name. I didn't know what he did, who he answered to, or what kind of world required a man to carry that much quiet control in his fingers. What I knew was that in a hospital full of people who only extended kindness when there was a camera pointed at them, a total stranger had just paid for my daughter's medicine and asked for nothing. Not a thank you, not a name, not a story he could tell later about the woman he'd helped. If you're tired of watching people with less talent and less heart get rewarded while the ones actually doing the work get overlooked, comment "real work" below, because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when quiet decency meets quiet greatness, and neither one of them backs down. And if stories like this one, about the moments that don't just entertain you but actually stay with you, are the kind you want more of, the description below has something for you. 2 full novels, currently discounted, one that will break your heart and one that will heal it, plus a free audiobook and access to every future release the moment it drops. If tonight's chapter moved you even a little, that collection will move you a lot more. Go check it out before the price goes back up. I would find out exactly what kind of world required hands like that 2 days later, at 11:40 on a Thursday night, when the doors of my trauma bay blew open and a gurney came through soaked in more blood than I'd seen in a single body in years. But before that, there was a highway. Before that, there was a man named Lee Jun-suk sitting in the back of an armored sedan, reading a shipping contract by the glow of his phone, completely unaware that somewhere in a server farm 2 states away, a piece of code his own security team hadn't caught was waiting for a signal. He didn't feel the car do anything strange at first. That was the terrifying part, the part nobody tells you about a professional hit. It doesn't announce itself. The engine didn't stutter. The wheel didn't jerk. The car simply stopped answering him. The brakes went soft under his driver's foot, like they were pressing into water instead of steel. And by the time either of them understood what was happening, they were doing 81 miles an hour in a vehicle that no longer belonged to them. The truck was already in position. It had been for 11 minutes, idling on the shoulder with its hazards on, looking like nothing more than a rig with engine trouble, driven by a man who'd been paid enough money to disappear afterward and never once think about turning around. When the sedan's onboard system fed the override its final command, the wheel wrenched hard to the right, and the truck pulled out at exactly the angle it needed to turn 11 tons of momentum into 11 tons of intention. Metal doesn't sound the way movies make it sound. It doesn't scream. It groans, low and wrong, like something enormous trying to speak through a mouth it was never built with, and then it goes quiet in a way that's worse than the noise. The sedan folded into itself on the driver's side. Jun-suk's bodyguard in the front seat was gone before the car finished spinning. In the back, Jun-suk was thrown against the reinforced door hard enough to crack 3 ribs and puncture a lung, his body absorbing a shockwave engineered by a man who had grown up calling him brother. Here's the question nobody in that hospital would think to ask for days. Not the trauma team, not the board, not even me at first, standing over his chart at 2 in the morning. How does a man survive an attack built specifically to kill him, on a night when his usual driver had called in sick, on a night when his route had been changed twice in the last hour for reasons no one could later explain? I didn't have the answer yet. I just had a body on a gurney and a clock that was already losing. By the time paramedics pried the door off what was left of that sedan, Jun-suk's blood pressure had already started its slow, terrifying collapse. Internal bleeding does that. It doesn't announce itself with drama. It just quietly starves a body of everything it needs to keep fighting. They called it in on the radio as a mass casualty single-vehicle collision, multi-system trauma, chest and abdomen, unresponsive on scene, and Metropolitan General's trauma wing lit up the way it does maybe twice a year. Every light red, every phone ringing, every resident moving like their own life depended on getting the bay prepped in under 4 minutes. I was 2 hours from the end of a double when the overhead system called it. Trauma 1, incoming, ETA 6 minutes, GSW protocol not applicable, blunt force polytrauma, possible cardiac involvement. I'd learned a long time ago to stop imagining faces before a patient arrived. It's a defense mechanism every good trauma surgeon builds, because if you picture someone's father, someone's husband, someone's son every single time those doors are about to open, you will not last 5 years in this specialty. So I didn't picture anyone. I checked my gloves, called for O-negative to be standing by, and positioned myself at the head of the bay the way I'd positioned myself 1,000 times before. The doors slammed open at 11:42. The gurney came through fast, paramedics shouting numbers over each other, a portable monitor screaming a heart rate that was climbing when it should have been falling, which meant his body was already trying to compensate for blood it didn't have anymore. There was so much red soaked through the sheet across his chest that for 1 second I registered him the way I register every trauma patient first, as a set of numbers, a pressure, a pulse, a countdown. And then the oxygen mask shifted an inch as they transferred him onto my table, and I saw his face. I stopped moving for exactly 1 second. 1 full second where every instinct I'd built over 14 years of trauma medicine went quiet, because the man lying broken in front of me, blood pressure collapsing, ribs shattered, chest barely rising, was the same man who had stood behind me in a grocery store 2 nights earlier and paid for my daughter's medicine without asking my name. If you believe a person's kindness should never be repaid with a death sentence, that the ones who quietly do good in this world deserve to still be standing when the world turns on them, say it with me in the comments right now. Not tonight. Because in the next few minutes, I was about to learn exactly how far one $22 act of grace was going to cost me to repay. That 1 second cost me nothing. What came after it cost me almost everything, because the moment I recognized his face, I also understood that I could not let anyone in that trauma bay see what I was feeling. Not shock, not recognition, not the strange, private ache of realizing the man who'd quietly saved my dignity 2 nights earlier was now the one bleeding out under my hands. A surgeon who lets her face tell the truth in a room full of residents loses the room. So I swallowed it, called out his vitals, and did what I was trained to do. I worked. We stabilized him enough to get him to imaging, which in trauma medicine is its own kind of miracle, a man that broken surviving the transfer at all. But when the scans came back, I understood why the room had gone quiet around the monitor. His aorta had a partial tear near the arch, the kind that doesn't forgive mistakes. His liver was lacerated in 2 places. 3 ribs had punctured toward his left lung, and there was a slow bleed pooling in his abdominal cavity that had already dropped his pressure twice in the last 20 minutes. It was, By any conventional measure, a catastrophic injury pattern. The kind hospitals write up in journals as cautionary tales, not success stories. Dr. Harrison arrived the way Dr. Harrison always arrived. Not running, never running, because running suggests urgency, and urgency suggests the kind of case that might not go well. And Dr. Harrison had built an entire career on never being associated with a case that might not go well. He looked at the scans on the light board for maybe 90 seconds. 90 seconds for a man's entire life. Multi-organ trauma, aortic involvement, active abdominal bleed, he said, like he was reading a grocery list instead of a death sentence. 99% mortality on the aortic repair alone, and that's before you factor in the liver and the chest. We're not opening him. I felt something cold settle in my chest, the specific coldness that comes from watching a decision get made about a life as if it were a line item on a budget. He's not a 99%, I said. He's a person on my table with a heartbeat right now. The window on that tier is narrow, but it's there. I've seen tighter margins close successfully. You've seen them close in a simulation, Dr. Spears, not in a living human being with this level of concurrent trauma. Harrison didn't even look at me when he said it. He was already turning toward the chart, already reaching for the pen that would make it official, that would turn a man into a statistic instead of a patient. We stabilize what we can, we keep him comfortable, and we call time of death when his body decides it's finished fighting for him. That's the compassionate choice here. Compassionate. I have heard a lot of words used to disguise cowardice in 14 years of medicine, but that one still finds a way to make my jaw tight every time I hear it deployed like a shield. Because it wasn't compassion driving that decision. It was math, the math of a man protecting his surgical outcome statistics, protecting a hospital board that got nervous every time a high-risk case with a well-known name walked through their doors, protecting his own name from ever being attached to a failure. Somewhere in that building, someone had already recognized exactly who was on that table, and Dr. Harrison had made a calculation that had nothing to do with the patient and everything to do with liability. Here's the part I couldn't say out loud in that room, the part that sat underneath everything. I had developed a bypass technique 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of tier, a modified approach that rerouted blood flow around the damaged section of the aorta while the repair was made, buying critical minutes that traditional clamping didn't allow. I'd published early findings on it. I'd been told in no uncertain terms by this same hospital's surgical review board that it was too aggressive, too experimental, too much of a liability to authorize for standard use. Dismissed, shelved, filed away next to every other idea of mine that had been quietly buried by men who preferred the safety of doing nothing to the risk of doing something extraordinary. I looked at the monitor. His heart rate was climbing again the way a failing heart climbs, too fast, too shallow, the body screaming for help it wasn't being given permission to receive. And underneath the panic of that number was a memory I couldn't shake, a black card sliding past my shoulder, a man who hadn't asked for my name before he decided I was worth helping. There's a technique, I said, and I felt the whole room shift toward me, because everyone in that trauma bay knew exactly which technique I meant. The bypass approach I published on. It buys time on the aortic tier that traditional clamping doesn't. I can stabilize the liver bleed concurrently if I move now. Harrison turned to face me fully for the first time, and I watched something flicker behind his eyes that wasn't concern for the patient at all. It was the look of a man calculating exposure. That technique was never approved for use in this hospital, Dr. Spears, and you know exactly why. If you touch that patient without my authorization, I will have your surgical privileges suspended before he's off this table. Do you understand me? This isn't a discussion. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it in real time, because this is the part that should make your blood boil. A man was dying in front of us. A man who 2 nights earlier had shown me more decency than half the doctors in that building had shown me in 3 years. And the person with the authority to save him was more concerned with his own liability than with the life on the table. They called it medical discretion in the official incident report later. What it actually was, standing there in that room, was cowardice wearing a white coat and a hospital badge, dressed up to look like wisdom. I looked at Harrison. Then I looked at the monitor, at the numbers ticking toward a place they couldn't come back from, and I felt 14 years of swallowed anger rise up in my chest all at once. Every time I'd been passed over, every time a man with less skill had taken credit for my work, every time I'd told myself to stay quiet and let my results speak for themselves in a system that had never once been listening. If you're as furious as I was standing in that room, if you believe a scared administrator should never get to decide who lives based on what protects his own name, hit that like button right now, because what I did in the next 60 seconds was going to end my career, or it was going to save a man's life. And in that moment, staring at a flat line waiting to happen, I already knew which one I could live with. That 14 years of swallowed anger didn't explode. It went cold and quiet and useful, the way real conviction does when you've spent a lifetime learning to control it in front of people who would use your emotion against you. "Get him to OR 4, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Now." Harrison started saying something about consequences, about insubordination, about a call he was going to make to the board before I'd even scrubbed in. But I had already stopped listening to him the way you stop listening to a smoke alarm once you understand there's no fire, just noise designed to make you feel like there is. I pushed past him toward the trauma bay doors, and that's when I saw the man standing just outside them, broad-shouldered, still in a suit despite the blood on his cuffs, eyes fixed on the gurney like he was trying to hold it together through will alone. I didn't know his name yet either. I would learn later it was Chief Bay, the man who had run security for Junesuck since before either of them had gray in their hair, the man who had been 2 cars back on the highway and had watched the whole thing happen through his windshield, helpless, screaming into a radio nobody answered fast enough. What I understood in that moment, without a single word passing between us, was that this man had already decided something about me. He'd watched me argue with Harrison through the observation glass. He'd read my face the way men who protect people for a living learn to read faces, and he'd made his choice before I'd made mine. "You're the one who can save him," he said, not a question. "I need an operating room Dr. Harrison hasn't locked me out of, and I need it in the next 4 minutes," I said. He didn't ask what that meant. He just turned, said something low and fast into a phone I hadn't seen him holding, and by the time we reached the surgical wing, 2 of his men were already positioned outside OR 4 like they'd been standing there their entire lives. That's the part that still unsettles me when I think back on it. How fast loyalty like that moves when it's real. How it doesn't hesitate the way institutional permission always hesitates. Harrison's world ran on committees and liability waivers. Chief Bay's world ran on a single word from the right person, and somewhere in that hospital, word had already traveled that I was that person. I found 3 nurses I trusted, women who had scrubbed in with me on cases other surgeons had walked away from, who had watched me pull people back from places the charts said they shouldn't have returned from. I didn't have to convince them of much. I told them what I needed. I told them what it would cost me if it went wrong, and I gave every one of them the chance to walk away with no judgment attached. Not one of them took it. Nurse Odom looked at me and said, "I've watched you do the impossible before, Dr. Spears. I'm not about to miss it this time." That's the kind of loyalty you can't request. You can only earn it, one exhausting double shift at a time, over years nobody claps for. We wheeled Junesuck into OR 4 at 11:58. His pressure had dropped again, his skin gone the pale gray-white that every trauma surgeon learns to recognize as the body starting to give up its fight in earnest. I checked the monitor. 62/40. Falling. I had somewhere between 8 and 15 minutes before that number stopped being a warning and started being a countdown to a flatline I couldn't reverse. Here's the question that sat in the back of my mind, even as my hands moved on autopilot, checking instruments, calling out numbers, positioning my team. Why had a man with this kind of protection, this kind of loyalty willing to move mountains for him in minutes, been left exposed enough on that highway for someone to get close enough to kill him? Somebody inside his own world had made that possible. I didn't have time to chase that thought all the way down. I filed it away, the way I file away everything that isn't the patient in front of me, and I kept moving. Harrison's voice came through the intercom outside the OR, sharp and furious, demanding the doors be opened. informing whoever would listen that Dr. Spears was operating without authorization, that hospital security was being called, that this was grounds for immediate termination and potential legal action. I heard Chief Bay's voice answer him through the door, low and absolutely without room for negotiation, and whatever Harrison said next, it didn't come through as clearly. I understood without needing to hear the details that security was not getting through that door tonight. Whether that should have frightened me or not is a fair question. In the moment, it didn't. In the moment, all I felt was room to work. I looked at my team. 3 nurses, an anesthesiologist who'd gone quiet the way people go quiet when they've decided to trust you completely, and a monitor counting down a man's life in numbers that kept sliding the wrong direction. I thought about every time I'd been told to wait my turn, to be patient, to let the system recognize my worth in its own time. I thought about a black card sliding past my shoulder in a grocery store, a debt I hadn't asked to owe and now couldn't walk away from. I nodded to the anesthesiologist. I held my hand out, and Nurse Odom placed the scalpel into it without me having to ask. "Lock the doors," I said. Nobody argued. Nobody hesitated. The heavy click of that lock engaging was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life, louder than any monitor alarm, louder than Harrison's voice on the other side of it, because in that single sound I understood exactly what I had just done. There was no walking this back. If I saved him, I would have to answer for how. If I lost him, I would lose everything. My license, my career, possibly my freedom, because a syndicate boss dying on an unauthorized operating table under an unapproved procedure was not a story that ended quietly for the surgeon who tried it. I looked down at the man on my table, the same steady hands that had slid a black card past my shoulder 2 nights earlier, now lying open and still, waiting entirely on mine. If my hands shook for even 1 second, he was going to die, and I was very possibly going to spend the rest of my career, maybe my freedom, explaining why I'd let him. They didn't shake. I made the first incision at exactly midnight, the monitor behind me reading 58/36 and falling, and somewhere on the other side of a locked door, a man who thought his title gave him the final say on who deserved to live was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The blade went in clean, and the moment it did, every wasted feeling I'd been carrying, the humiliation at the register, the fury in Harrison's office, the fear pounding under my own ribs, went quiet, replaced by the one thing that has never once failed me in 14 years of trauma medicine, the work itself. What I found when I opened him was worse than the scans suggested, which happens more often than people realize. Imaging shows you shadows and measurements. It doesn't show you the way tissue actually behaves under your hands, the way a body improvises its own catastrophe in real time. The tear near his aortic arch had extended 0.5 centimeter further than the scan indicated, curling dangerously close to a branch vessel that, if nicked, would turn a difficult repair into an unsurvivable one. His liver had a second laceration deeper than the first read suggested, already seeping steadily into his abdominal cavity. And his left lung, punctured by the 3rd rib, was fighting against a slow collapse that was quietly stealing oxygen from a body that had almost none to spare. 3 fatal injuries, 3 separate countdowns running at once. In a training hospital, they teach you that a surgeon's job is to prioritize, stabilize the most immediately lethal threat first, then work outward. But there was no clean order here. If I focused fully on the aortic tear, the liver bleed would drain him before I finished. If I focused on the liver, the aortic wall could rupture completely under the pressure shifts of the repair. I had less than 2 millimeters of clean tissue to work with on the arch, working in a cavity where one wrong motion meant catastrophic, immediate hemorrhage. This is the moment where my technique either justified every year Harrison and men like him had spent dismissing it, or it killed a man on my table and ended my career in the same 60 seconds. I didn't have room in my mind for that thought, so I set it down the way you set down anything that isn't useful to you when a life is bleeding out in front of you, and I began the bypass, rerouting blood flow around the damaged section of the arch, using a graft technique I had spent 2 years refining on paper, because no one would let me refine it in practice. My hands knew the motion even though my hands had never actually done it on a living person before. That's the strange truth about mastery nobody tells you. Sometimes your body has rehearsed something in your mind so many thousand times that when the real moment finally arrives, it doesn't feel like the first time at all. Pressure's dropping, 54/30. My anesthesiologist called out, voice tight but steady. I hear you, I said, and I did not look up, because looking up cost seconds I didn't have, and seconds were the only currency that mattered in that room. I want you to understand something about what real surgical focus feels like, because it isn't the calm, serene image people picture. It's a narrowing so total that the rest of the world simply stops existing. I couldn't hear the alarm outside the door anymore, the one that had been going since Harrison first realized security wasn't getting through. I couldn't feel my own shoulders, tight and burning from holding one position too long. I couldn't feel time passing in any normal sense. Only in the numbers Nurse Odom called out to me every 90 seconds, only in the shrinking gap between where his aorta was tearing and where I needed it to hold. Here's what I didn't know yet, what none of us in that room knew as I worked. The crash that had put him on my table hadn't been a random act of road violence at all, and somewhere outside that hospital, the man who had ordered it was already receiving updates on whether his target had survived the emergency room, updates that would soon tell him something had gone very wrong with his plan. I completed the graft on the aortic arch at 12:41, watched the repair hold under pressure, and moved immediately to the liver, packing and suturing the deeper laceration while Nurse Odom suctioned faster than I had ever seen her move. Every motion after that first successful repair felt different, sharper, more certain, like my hands had found a rhythm the rest of me could finally trust. I reinflated the collapsed portion of his lung, watched it expand on the monitor in a way that made my own chest loosen slightly for the first time in 40 minutes. Through the small observation window in the OR door, I caught a glimpse of Harrison. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was standing perfectly still, staring through that glass with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before, not anger, not authority, but something closer to disbelief. The look of a man watching something he'd spent his whole career insisting was impossible happen directly in front of him, in real time, at the hands of the surgeon he'd threatened to destroy for even attempting it. I didn't have time to feel satisfaction in that. I barely had time to register it before the monitor behind me let out a sound every trauma surgeon learns to fear more than any other, the flat, sustained tone of a heart that had finally stopped fighting altogether. If you're watching this, and you've ever had someone in a position of power tell you what you're capable of instead of letting your work speak for itself, comment, prove them wrong right now, because Harrison was about to watch a woman he tried to silence bring a dead man back to life with her bare hands, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it. And if this story has you sitting on the edge of your seat, you need to see what happens when Lily's world collides with the kind of stories that don't just entertain you but leave a mark. The discounted 2-novel collection linked below is exactly that. Founding member pricing won't last, and once it's gone, along with your access to every future release included free. Don't be the one telling yourself later that you meant to grab it. Get it now, while you still can. A flatline doesn't ask permission before it stops the whole world, and mine stopped for exactly 1 second before training took over where fear tried to. Charging, my anesthesiologist called, already reaching for the defibrillator paddles while Nurse Odom began compressions, her hands finding the rhythm without needing to be told. I stepped back from the field just long enough to let them work, my own heart hammering in a way I hadn't allowed it to since I'd made that first incision. This is the part of trauma medicine nobody prepares you for in medical school, the seconds where you are not the one in control, where you have to trust that the machine, the compressions, the training of the people around you will buy back what your hands need to finish the job. Clear, she said, and his chest jumped under the paddles. Nothing, we tried again, still nothing. On the third shock, the monitor stuttered back into a rhythm, weak, irregular, but present, a heartbeat clawing its way back from somewhere it had no business returning from. I felt my own breath release for the first time in what felt like minutes. We're back, I said, and turned back to the field, back to the delicate work of closing the aortic repair before his body decided to try quitting on me again. That's when the lights went out. Not flickered, not dimmed. Gone completely, instantly, the entire operating room swallowed into a blackness so total that for one disorienting second I couldn't tell if I'd lost my vision or the room had simply ceased to exist around me. Every monitor died with it. The soft, steady beeping that had been the room's heartbeat for the last hour, gone, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of alarm. Somewhere behind me, Nurse Odom made a sound that wasn't quite a scream but was close enough to it, and I understood. In the half-second it took my eyes to adjust to nothing, exactly what had happened. This wasn't a normal outage. Hospitals are built with redundancy stacked on redundancy specifically so that an operating room never loses power mid-procedure, backup generators that engage within seconds, secondary grids, fail-safes on fail-safes. For all of that to fail at once. Someone had to want it to fail. Someone had gone looking for the exact breaker that fed this exact room. At the exact moment a man they needed dead was showing every sign of surviving. I had a scalpel in a chest cavity with a partially completed suture line on a vessel that would rupture catastrophically if I moved wrong in the dark. And somewhere in this hospital, someone had decided that finishing what the highway started was worth risking every other patient on this floor. "Nobody move," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect, because panic in that room right now would kill him faster than the darkness would. "Everybody stay exactly where your hands are. I need light now, whatever we can get." Phones came out first, small cold rectangles of blue-white light that barely reached the field, throwing everything into strange, shifting shadows that made depth almost impossible to judge. Then someone, I never did find out which one of Chief Bay's men had the presence of mind to do it, kicked open the OR door hard enough to crack the frame, and 2 headlamps came through the dark toward us. The kind security teams carry for exactly this reason, strong enough to actually illuminate a surgical field. "Backup generator should have kicked in 15 seconds ago," my anesthesiologist said, voice tight, hands moving by feel to manually bag oxygen into a man who no longer had a ventilator keeping that rhythm steady for him. "It's not engaging." That was the piece that told me everything I needed to know. A normal outage engages backup power within seconds. It's automatic, mechanical, built to fail towards safety. For the backup to also be down meant someone hadn't just tripped a breaker. Someone had gone into that system deliberately, with knowledge of exactly how a hospital's power redundancy worked, and had disabled both layers at once. That kind of access wasn't random. That kind of access belonged to someone who had reason to be inside that system in the first place. An employee, a contractor, someone who worked in this building and had walked its halls with a badge that said they belonged here. I held the position of my hands exactly where they'd been the second the lights died, because moving even slightly in that field without proper visibility risked nicking the exact vessel I'd spent 40 minutes protecting. Headlamp light isn't surgical light. It throws shadows in the wrong places, flattens depth, makes the difference between healthy tissue and a critical vessel harder to judge by color alone. I had to trust my hands the way I hadn't had to trust them in years. Not my eyes first, my hands first, feeling the tension and texture of what I was working with the way I'd been trained to before hospitals had light bright enough to make that skill optional. "Odom, hold that light steady right here. Don't move it unless I tell you," I said. "Everyone else, eyes on the monitor the second it comes back. I need to know the moment we have a heartbeat reading again." I finished the final critical suture on the aortic graft by the unsteady glow of a headlamp and 2 cell phones, my hands moving through motion memory built over 14 years. Because in that moment, motion memory was the only thing standing between a man surviving and a man dying twice in one night in the same room. Somewhere above us, through the thin walls of that operating theater, I could hear raised voices, running footsteps, the sound of a hospital realizing something was deeply wrong on this floor. And I understood, with a cold certainty settling into my chest alongside the adrenaline, that whoever had cut that power was still inside this building, still close enough to know whether their plan had worked. If you believe someone willing to kill a hospital's power grid to finish an assassination deserves to be exposed in front of everyone, say, "Lights on," in the comments right now. Because in the next few minutes, We were about to find out exactly how far this hospital's own walls had been compromised, and whether the danger in that room had already found its way past the doors we thought were locked. Whoever had cut that power was still inside this building, still close enough to know whether their plan had worked, and I made a decision then, in the dark, with a scalpel steady in my hand, that they were not going to get the answer they were hopping for. The graft was closed. Every tear, every laceration I had chased through his chest and abdomen for the better part of an hour was finally sealed, packed, and holding. But closed vessels mean nothing if the heart behind them has stopped pumping blood through them, and his had been silent for the better part of a minute now, that same flat, sustained tone still hanging in the dark where the monitor used to be, except now I couldn't even see the number. I could only feel for it. I did the thing you only do when every other option has been exhausted, when the chest is already open, and there is no time to close it first and try defibrillation the conventional way. I reached directly into his chest cavity, cupped his heart between my hands, and began internal cardiac massage, rhythmic, controlled compression, my palms doing what a machine couldn't do fast enough in a room with no working equipment. "Talk to me," I said to my anesthesiologist, not because I expected good news, but because silence in that moment would have been unbearable. "Nothing yet," she said. "Keep going." I kept going. I want you to understand what that actually feels like, holding a human heart in your own two hands, willing it back into rhythm through nothing but pressure and prayer and 14 years of muscle memory, in a room lit by nothing but 2 cell phones, and a headlamp held steady by a nurse whose own hands were shaking now, even as she kept that light exactly where I needed it. There is no dignified way to describe that kind of fear. It sits behind your ribs and refuses to leave, even while your hands keep moving like they belong to someone calmer than you actually are. "Charge again," I said. "We shock through the massage, now." The paddles came down, smaller internal ones this time, direct against the muscle itself. "Clear," my anesthesiologist called, and his heart jumped once under my palms, hard, unmistakable, and then went still again. Here's the piece I hadn't let myself think about until that exact second, the question that had been sitting quietly under everything since the lights first went out. If whoever cut that power was still inside this building, were they going to try again? Was this outage the only move they had, or was there a second one waiting for the moment we thought we'd won? I didn't have room to chase that thought any further than that, because his heart needed me more than my fear did. "Again," I said. Second shock, nothing. I felt something in my own chest tighten in a way it hadn't the entire surgery, not during the crash report, not during Harrison's threats, not even during the first flatline. Because I understood with total clarity that I was running out of options in a dark room with borrowed light and a body that had already been fighting for its life twice tonight. I thought about the black card sliding past my shoulder. I thought about my daughter asleep at home, unaware that her mother was standing in the dark with someone's whole life resting between her hands. I thought about every person who had ever told me I wasn't good enough for this, wasn't ready for this, should wait my turn for this, and I refused, completely and finally, to let this be the night any of them turned out to be right. "One more time," I said. "Charge." The third shock hit, and for 10 of the longest seconds I have ever lived through, absolutely nothing happened. 10 seconds of a dark room, a held breath from every person standing in it, a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears louder than anything else in that space. And then, a beat. Small, uneven, uncertain, but real, the kind of first beat that sounds less like a machine and more like a person deciding, somewhere deep and involuntary, that they are not finished yet. Then another. Then a third, steadier than the one before it, and by the 5th beat the rhythm under my palms had found something close to normal, strong enough that I could finally, carefully, let go and let his own body carry the work forward. The lights came back on 11 seconds later, the backup generator finally forcing its way through whatever had been done to it, and the monitor flickered awake with it, numbers climbing into place, a heart rate reading that made Nurse Odom actually gasp out loud. 88 beats per minute. Steady, strong, alive. I don't remember deciding to cry. I remember realizing there were tears on my face only because Nurse Odom reached over, still holding that headlamp with one shaking hand, and gently wiped one from my cheek with the back of her glove before either of us said a single word. Nobody in that room spoke for almost a full minute. We just stood there, in a space that 30 seconds earlier had felt like a tomb, listening to a steady, rhythmic beeping that sounded, in that moment, like the single most beautiful sound any of us had ever heard. Through the observation glass, I saw Dr. Harrison. He hadn't moved through any of it, not the flat line, not the darkness, not the 3 shocks in the dead of black silence. He was standing exactly where he'd been standing an hour earlier, except now his face had lost every trace of the certainty it carried when he told me this man was already beyond saving. I watched him look at that monitor, watched him understand in real time that everything he had staked his authority on in that room had just been proven wrong by the very surgeon he'd threatened to end. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any argument he could have made, and every nurse in that room saw it too. But even as the relief settled over us, even as I finally allowed my shoulders to drop for the first time in an hour, I couldn't shake the question still sitting cold in my chest. Somewhere in this hospital, the person who had cut that power was still walking these halls, and they now knew exactly how badly their plan had failed. That question got its answer faster than I expected, and not in a way that let anyone in that hospital breathe easy. We moved him to the ICU just after 2 in the morning, his vitals stable enough for transport, but still fragile in the way a body always is after it has been asked to survive something it wasn't built to survive. Chief Bay walked beside the gurney the entire way, one hand never far from his jacket, his eyes scanning every hallway intersection, every open door, every staff member we passed like each one was a potential threat until proven otherwise. I understood, watching him work, that this was a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping one person alive, and tonight had come closer than any night before it to failing at the only job he'd ever had. It was on floor 5, 20 feet from the ICU doors, that the threat found us. 2 orderlies were pushing a supply cart down the hallway, badges visible, scrubs pressed, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. Nothing about them should have drawn a second look. That was, I would learn later, precisely the point. But Chief Bay's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the gurney rail as they approached, and I watched his eyes drop, just briefly, to the way one of them was gripping the cart. Too high, too tense, the grip of a man bracing for something rather than simply pushing a cart down a quiet hallway at 2 in the morning. He didn't shout. He didn't draw attention. He simply shifted his body a half step to the left, angling himself between the gurney and the approaching cart, and said something low in Korean to the guard on the other side of me, who peeled off without hesitation and closed the distance to the 2 orderlies in 4 unhurried strides. What happened next took less than 15 seconds, and I only caught pieces of it, because my job in that moment was June Suk's monitor, not the hallway. I heard a sharp intake of breath. I heard the metallic clatter of something small and dense hitting the floor, a weapon, I understood later, one that had been hidden beneath a folded blanket on that cart, close enough to the gurney that it would have taken almost nothing to use it. I heard Chief Bay's voice again, flat and final, giving an instruction that needed no translation to understand its meaning. And then the hallway went quiet again, the 2 men in stolen scrubs escorted through a side door by security personnel who had appeared. I realized, exactly on cue, which told me they had been positioned there before we ever arrived on this floor. Chief Bay hadn't been reacting to a threat. He'd been anticipating one. Here's the part that unsettled me more than the almost attack itself. How had 2 men gotten hospital-issued scrubs and a supply cart onto a restricted ICU floor in the first place? That wasn't the kind of access strangers walked into. That was the kind of access that required someone already inside this building to open a door that should have stayed closed. I didn't have time to sit with that thought, because Chief Bay simply resumed walking beside the gurney like nothing had happened at all, his composure so complete that if I hadn't been standing 3 feet away, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the entire thing. "You should get him settled," he said to me quietly, in English this time, his voice steady in a way that told me this was not the first time he'd had to protect his boss from something that wanted him dead, and probably wouldn't be the last. I'll make sure this floor stays clean. We got him into his room. I checked his lines myself, checked the graft site, checked the monitor readings one more time even though every number told me the same thing the last hour had already proven. That against every prediction Harrison had made in that trauma bay, this man was going to live. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, feeling something in my own body finally start to unclench after nearly 3 hours of holding it together through sheer will. That was when his eyes opened. Not fully, not all at once. The slow, disoriented flutter of a man surfacing from anesthesia and blood loss, and a night his body had no business surviving. His gaze moved across the ceiling first, then the machines beside him, then, slowly to me, standing at his bedside checking the numbers on his monitor. And I watched something happen in his face that I will remember for the rest of my career. Not confusion, not the blank disorientation most patients wear in that first moment of waking. Recognition. Immediate and complete, the kind that doesn't need explanation, because somewhere underneath the pain medication and the exhaustion of nearly dying twice in one night, he knew exactly who was standing over him. He wasn't looking at a surgeon in scrubs checking his vitals. He was looking at the woman from a grocery store 2 nights earlier, the one whose card had been declined in front of a line of strangers, the one he had quietly helped without asking for a single thing in return. His lips parted. I could see him trying to form words, his throat too dry, his body too weak to manage more than a rough exhale of breath, but I understood what he was trying to say before he ever got the chance to say it. I reached over gently, resting my hand briefly against his arm, careful of the IV line, careful of everything his body had just survived. "Don't," I said quietly. "Save your strength. Your $22 already said everything it needed to say. Tonight, I'm the one who owed you." Something shifted in his eyes then, something too tired and too raw to be anything but genuine. And for a moment, the two of us just stayed like that. A surgeon and the stranger she had spent the last 3 hours fighting to keep alive, connected by a debt neither of us had asked to create, in a hospital room that had almost become his last one. And then, from somewhere down the hallway outside, I heard raised voices again, sharper this time, more urgent, followed by the unmistakable sound of Chief Bay's men moving fast toward the ICU entrance. And I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that whatever had almost happened on floor 5 a few minutes earlier wasn't finished yet. Whatever had almost happened on floor 5 wasn't finished that night. But by morning I understood it had never been about finishing anything in that hallway at all. It had been a test, a probe to see how deep Han Seung-woo's reach still went inside a building he no longer controlled, and Chief Bay's men had answered that test by making sure the 2 intruders never left the premises to report back. That's the thing about men like Seung-woo. They mistake caution for weakness, and they mistake a woman with a scalpel for someone who won't remember exactly who tried to kill her patient twice in one night. Over the following weeks, while Jun-suk recovered under my care, Chief Bay and his loyalists quietly built a case that would have taken federal investigators years to assemble. Financial records showing Seung-woo diverting shipping assets into offshore accounts months before the crash. Communications tracing the electronic override on that sedan back to a contractor Seung-woo had personally hired, and testimony from the 2 men caught outside the ICU, who gave up his name faster than either of them probably expected to when faced with the alternative. Jun-suk didn't need violence to end this the way his organization once might have. He needed evidence, patience, and the kind of quiet resolve I recognized because I carried it myself. When he finally walked back into his own headquarters 6 weeks later, steady on his feet, the scar from his surgery still healing beneath his collar, he didn't raise his voice once. He simply laid every document on the table in front of the men Seung-woo had spent months quietly courting, and watched their loyalty realign in real time, the way loyalty always does when the truth becomes undeniable. Seung-woo was handed over to federal authorities before the week was out, his empire of ambition collapsing under the weight of evidence he never saw coming, because he had made the same mistake every man like him makes. He underestimated exactly how far people will go for someone who once showed them real respect. While that war quietly resolved itself outside those hospital walls, mine was just beginning inside them. The hospital board called me in 8 days after that surgery, the formal notice arriving with language so carefully bureaucratic it almost disguised what it actually was: insubordination, unauthorized use of an experimental procedure, defiance of a direct order from the chief of surgery, conduct unbecoming, grounds for potential termination of privileges. I read that letter 3 times sitting at my kitchen table, Nia doing her homework across from me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, something closer to peace. Because whatever they decided in that room, I already knew the truth of what I'd done, and for the first time in 14 years, I wasn't going to sit quietly and let someone else write the story of my own competence. I walked into that boardroom on a Tuesday morning in a blazer I'd worn to exactly one interview a decade earlier, back when I still believed hard work alone would be enough to open doors in that building. Dr. Harrison was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by 2 board members I recognized and one I didn't, a folder open in front of him that I assumed contained every argument he'd rehearsed about liability, protocol, and the dangerous precedent of letting surgeons operate outside approved procedure. He didn't look at me when I sat down. He looked satisfied, the particular satisfaction of a man who believes the outcome of a meeting has already been decided in his favor before it even begins. "Dr. Spears," he began, folder open, voice already sliding into the practiced cadence of a man who had delivered this exact speech in his head 100 times. "The board has reviewed the incident from the 14th, and I think we can all agree that regardless of outcome, the process by which—" The door behind me opened before he finished the sentence. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I watched it happen instead on every face at that table, the shift from bored procedural patience to something close to disbelief, spreading across the room like weather. Dr. Harrison's mouth actually stopped moving mid-sentence. One of the board members half rose from her chair before catching herself. Because walking into that room, steady and composed in a dark suit that gave no hint of the man who'd been clinically dead on my operating table 3 weeks earlier, was Lee Jun-suk. And everyone at that table understood immediately, in the way people always understand power the moment it enters a room, exactly who they were looking at. "Please," he said, his voice calm, unhurried, the same voice that had told a cashier to put my groceries on his card without asking for my name. "Continue. I'd like to hear the rest of that sentence, Dr. Harrison." Harrison did not continue the rest of that sentence. Harrison, in fact, appeared to have forgotten how sentences worked entirely, his eyes moving between Jun-suk and the folder in front of him like the 2 things could not possibly exist in the same reality he had been operating in 10 seconds earlier. "I understand there's a question here," Jun-suk continued, walking further into the room, unhurried, every step deliberate, "about whether Dr. Spears should have been permitted to save my life. I have some thoughts on that if the board is willing to hear them. I also understand Dr. Harrison examined my case and determined I had a 99% chance of dying. I'd be curious to know what statistic he'd assign to my chances now, sitting here in front of him." Here's the question that sat underneath everything happening in that room, one none of those board members had thought to ask themselves until this exact moment. How many other patients, over how many years, had walked through those doors with a real chance at survival, only to be written off by a man protecting his own numbers instead of their lives? I watched it land on their faces one by one, the understanding that today's meeting was no longer about disciplining me at all. Corporate politics, I learned that day, ends remarkably fast when the man they were protecting their reputation from is standing in the room, alive, because a doctor they'd threatened to fire refused to follow an order that would have killed him. If you believe hard-earned respect always finds its way back to the person who deserves it, share this video right now with someone who needs to hear that today, because what Jun-suk said next in that boardroom was about to change the rest of Dr. Harrison's career, and mine, forever. Corporate politics ends fast, but it doesn't end quietly, and what happened in that boardroom over the next 20 minutes was the loudest silence I have ever sat inside. Dr. Harrison closed the folder in front of him, the one holding my termination paperwork, the language about insubordination and unauthorized procedure and conduct unbecoming. And for a long moment he didn't say anything at all, because there was nothing left in that folder that mattered anymore. Jun-suk pulled out the chair across from him and sat down like he'd been invited, though nobody at that table had the composure left to invite or deny him anything. "I want to be precise about something," he said, and his voice carried the same unhurried weight it had carried in a grocery store on a rainy Tuesday, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. Dr. Harrison looked at my scans and told a room full of people I was a 99%. He told them opening me up was a liability the hospital couldn't afford. I'd like the board to understand that the only reason I'm sitting in this chair, breathing, speaking, is that Dr. Spears decided his math was wrong. He let that sit. Nobody at that table moved to fill the silence, not even Harrison, whose face had gone the particular gray of a man watching his own career narrate itself back to him from the other side of the table. One of the board members, the woman who'd half risen from her seat when Jun-suk walked in, finally found her voice. She asked, carefully, what exactly he was proposing. And I want you to understand, because I need you to feel it the way I felt it sitting in that room, that I had no idea what was coming next either. I had walked in that morning bracing myself to lose my license. I had not walked in bracing myself for this. "I'm proposing an investment," Jun-suk said. $50 million, earmarked for a new trauma center, the kind of facility this hospital should have built a decade ago, with the equipment and the redundancy and the staffing to make sure the next patient who comes through those doors at midnight has more than one doctor in the building willing to fight for them. He didn't look at Harrison when he said it, though every word was clearly meant for him. "There's one condition attached to that gift, and it isn't negotiable. Dr. Lily Spears runs it, not oversees it, not consults on it, runs it. Chief of surgery, full authority over trauma protocol, effective immediately." I felt my own breath catch in a way surgery never manages to make it catch. 14 years of being talked over in rooms exactly like this one. 14 years of watching men with softer hands and smaller nerve take credit for work I'd bled for. And here was a man who'd known my name for exactly 19 days, offering me the one thing this hospital had spent a decade making sure I understood I would never be given. Here's the part I still turn over some nights, the part I couldn't let myself ask out loud in that room. How does a man decide, in the space of one conversation, to hand a woman he barely knows the kind of trust an institution had spent years deciding she hadn't earned? I didn't have an answer sitting at that table. I'm not sure I fully have one now. What I had instead was Jun-suk turning to look at me for the first time since he'd walked in, and saying simply, "If the board won't have her, I'll build the center somewhere that will." The vote, when it finally came, took less time than the silence before it. Nobody in that room was foolish enough to let $50 million and a very alive syndicate boss walk back out the door over a decision they could reverse in 30 seconds. Dr. Harrison resigned before the meeting formally adjourned. No severance conversation, no drawn-out negotiation, just a man quietly understanding that the room he'd built his entire authority inside no longer had any use for him. He didn't look at me on his way out. I didn't need him to. I'd spent 14 years needing men like him to see me. That morning, for the first time, I realized I didn't anymore. If you've ever sat in a room and watched someone finally answer for every time they made you feel small, comment, seen, right now. Because Dr. Harrison walked out of that building the same day, I walked into an office with my name on the door. And there is nothing in this world more satisfying than watching cowardice lose to competence in real time. I stood in that empty boardroom a long while after everyone else had gone, running my thumb over a nameplate someone from facilities had already, somehow, had engraved and waiting on the table. Dr. Lily Spears, Chief of Surgery. And I thought about a receipt folded in my coat pocket for $91 I never paid. A debt I'd carried home from a grocery store, not knowing it would eventually pay me back 100 times over. I thought about every patient I would meet in that new trauma center who would never know the story behind why it existed, who would only know that when their gurney came through those doors at midnight, there would be a surgeon in that building who had already decided, a long time ago, that no life was a statistic worth writing off before she'd even tried. Jun-suk found me in the hallway on his way out, and he didn't say much, he never does. He just extended his hand, the same steady hand that had once slid a black card past my shoulder, and said, "I told you. I already knew you were worth it." I didn't have anything clever to say back. I just shook his hand and let myself, for one quiet second in an empty hallway, feel exactly as proud as 14 years of swallowed dignity deserved to feel. If a story about quiet decency finding its way home means something to you tonight, the 2-novel collection linked below is built out of exactly this kind of grace under pressure. One story that will wreck you, one that will put you back together, both discounted right now with a free audiobook included. Go get your copy before the price changes, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story about resilience, justice, and a woman who finally got to walk into the room she'd earned.